Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed a taste of Keane Symphony that we just heard. And I'm so pleased to see you here for our event tonight with intentional hiking. So I'm really thrilled to have composer and pianist Keane Southard here to tell us about his Appalachian Trail hike, which inspired a symphony. So Keane holds a PhD in music composition from the Eastman School of Music and believes deeply in the power of music to be a catalyst for positive change in the world. I'm really looking forward to learning all about his process and inspiration to turn a hike into an auditory journey. I am your host, Renee Shira Patrick, and I'm an addicted long distance backpacker who discovered the amazing and empowering feeling of spending extended time in nature on the Appalachian Trail as well. So I started through hiking in 2002, 22 years ago, and was lucky enough to return to the AT for a couple months 2 years ago. So I have a close fondness and relationship with that mountain range as well. So I created this event series to help myself and others like you in the hiking community develop a culture of thoughtfulness and intention about the time we spend outside on trails. So thank you for being here. A couple housekeeping items. Please use the chat throughout the event. You can share comments, reactions, use the emoji feature, but anytime you feel compelled to share something, please do. Next, please keep your video on or turn your video on when we get to the conversation portion of tonight. The series is as much about building community as it is learning more about the specific topic. So I think seeing each other will help in fostering those connections. And I also want to thank Maytal, who is providing event support tonight. So she's going to be working some magic behind the scenes. So let's get started with tonight's event flow. So first, I'm going to give an introduction about what to expect tonight. We'll hear from Keane. He'll be giving us a presentation, I think some more snippets of his symphony. And after that, we're going to have a giveaway for a membership to the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. So they're the organization in charge of maintaining and protecting the AT. Then we'll get into the conversation portion of the event for about 15 minutes. And finally, we'll have a wrap up all together. So the whole event will take an hour to an hour and a half. For those of you joining for the first time, each intentional hiking event will be focused on one of the following themes: do, learn, create, be, and a regional focus. So this one tonight is a create event, focus on turning a hike into an inspired musical journey. I'm bringing you all together through these events because I believe we're a powerful force for change. Beyond developing an intentional hiking practice in our own personal trail experiences, I think the impacts and effects of our actions can help influence the world around us. Now I have a couple of questions for you. So please either raise your real hand or your emoji hand. How many of you feel creatively inspired when you are hiking? Like, who out there gets inspired? And now, how many of you turn that inspiration into something tangible, either during your hike or after? Like that, whether it's writing music or I like to write, write or photography. Awesome, a lot of creative folks out there. And this one, please take to the chat. What is your artistic pursuit? So I'm interested, how many, I imagine there's a fair amount of musicians here tonight because of the topic with Keane, but maybe there's photographers or painters, writers. So I'd love to see in the chat, what do you like to do if you are one of those creative folks? Let's see. Yeah, so go ahead and chime in as the event goes. And yeah, just curious about that. So I recently read a fascinating excerpt from a study from Stanford University that found walking can increase creative output by a staggering 60%. What's especially interesting about the report was it was the act of walking itself, not necessarily the environment, that was the main factor. So across the board, creativity levels were consistently and significantly higher for those walking compared to sitting. And I'm sure all of you know that because you like to hike and create as well. But it's interesting that, yes, the vast vistas that we gaze on when we reach a peak or take a break are important. Maybe the sound of the birds and the trees, or watching the stream, bubble along. They're impactful, but simply moving our bodies at a gentle pace brings the most impact. So I'm someone who, when I'm hiking, I said I like to write. So I'm constantly taking notes when I'm hiking about good ideas I have or connections I make about different issues that my brain is sort of mulling over. And these are all things that sometimes make it into the daily blog that I write when I'm hiking. And it really happens without me purposely thinking about it. I like to think when I'm walking, my brain just gets a chance to play. I'm just existing and my brain is coming up with all these creative connections. So even though it seems like it's coming from nowhere, our bodies are actually providing a lot of that fuel, that food for these creative pursuits that we have. So I'm excited to learn more about Keane's process for turning a walk, a hike into a piece of music. And we're also going to leave time at the end after Keane's presentation for some Q&A. So if you have some questions that come up and you'd like to ask him, please keep them in mind, and we'll save some time at the end for you to ask. So with that, Keane, I'm going to pass the presentation on to you.
Okay, thank you, Renee. One thing you just talking about walking, the act of walking stimulating the creativity. I believe, if I remember correctly, Beethoven did that a lot. Often went for walks, brought a little notebook, and would get ideas and write them down. So yeah, we're in good company. Okay, I'm going to share my screen with my presentation here, and we can get started. Although, first slide. Okay, great. So thank you all for coming. I'm Keane Southard, as you've heard, and my trail name. But those of you who don't know, when you're out on, especially doing a long distance hike, hikers adopt these pseudonyms. And my trail name was Mozart, very appropriately. So, but yeah, you almost never learn other hikers' real names. You only learn their trail names. So starting at the very beginning, my introduction to the Appalachian Trail. I grew up in central Massachusetts, and my parents, who are here tonight virtually, Maynard and Betsy, brought me and my three siblings on so many trips up to New Hampshire and Vermont to go camping, not so much hiking, but a lot of camping, and going in the back roads and everything of New England, which sort of instilled this love of this region, where I now live in Vermont. And particularly, my father went to graduate school at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire, which happens to be a town where the Appalachian Trail runs right through it. And so that's how I became acquainted with it. I remember you could see where the trail leaves the town and goes up into the woods. And I just thought it was crazy. That goes all the way to Maine, and it goes the other way, all the way to Georgia, and people walk that? Like, how do they do that? That in 2,000 plus miles. And so I was just fascinated by that. And thought, well, maybe one day I could do that, And then as I grew up and got more interested in music and composing, somehow it mixed with those two things mixed. And I thought, what if I hiked it and then wrote a symphony inspired by it? That would be so cool to put that journey into music. And at some point, about 10 years ago or so, I realized no one's going to ask me to do that. If I'm going to make this happen, I need to actually take the initiative and try to do it. So my idea was to set up some parameters for what this symphony might look like, but very loose, and then pitch it to orchestras to commission that work, to give me the guarantee that they will perform it. Because I didn't want to just write this big piece and then try to get it performed, which is really, really hard because orchestras have Beethoven and Mozart and Brahms and all these, hundreds of years of these masterworks that they love to play. And many of them don't like to take the chance on something they don't know what it's going to sound like. So I thought, well, I think this is a really cool idea. I want to try to pitch the idea first and then write it. And so what I decided was I wanted to just hike the New England portion for a couple of reasons. One, in terms of the amount of time I had to do the hike, which was, I just had a summer. So I didn't have the 5 or 6 months that it takes to do a through hike and do the entire trail. I'd also never done more than a one night, 2-day, 1 night hike before. And so I thought, I don't know if I can make it 2,000 miles. 730 miles, which is the New England portion, a third of the whole, is a little more manageable. Still, I was worried about it, and then, New England, as I said, is my home region that I love the most. I thought that would be a great place to start and focus in. And then I had this idea that I would have one movement for each state that the trail and my journey goes through. So I decided I was going to start at the New York, Connecticut border and then hike through Connecticut and then through Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. So 5 different movements, have a movement for each state. And of course, I thought it would be great to end at the end at Mount Katahdin, the highest point in Maine, would be a great way to finish it, rather than going southbound and ending at the New York, Connecticut border, which is, not a big landmark. It wouldn't make a good end to the symphony. And then the other idea up front was that it was going to be a celebration of the beauty of the trail and the wilderness of New England. And I also actually tried to tie into doing it around the 80th anniversary of the completion of the trail as well. And then my pitch to the orchestras was this could help first share this with this experience with classical music audiences who may or may not be people who are interested in the outdoors, and vice versa, bringing people to orchestras that may or may not be fans of classical music. So then I spent 2015 into 2016 pitching the idea to basically every orchestra in New England. I was trying to get at least one orchestra from each of those 5 states to co-commission it and bring it to life. And I got 4, which I was pretty happy about. And so then the hike. So this was the summer of 2016. I began on June 11th at the New York, Connecticut border, finished August 26th, 2016 at the Mount Katahdin summit, the northern terminus of the trail. It was 67 days of hiking. And that doesn't include 10 days in the middle. I took off to go to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, actually, where I was having a piece premiered there. And when I began the hike, I really tried to, other than the ideas I just talked about, have a kind of blank slate for what this piece would become. Because I really wanted to have it emerge from my actual experience and not come in with too many preconceived ideas about what it might sound like. So I brought 2 tools, special tools to help with that. One was carrying a small notebook of staff paper, so it had the 5 lines across, so that I could write down in musical notation any ideas that came to me when I was hiking. And that actually doubled as my journal, because I could just write words in it as well. I could ignore the staff lines and just write words too. And then I also brought a very small digital audio recording. Actually, I think I have that right here, if I can find it. If I can get this. Oh, my drawer is not opening. But anyways, it's a little digital battery powered audio recorder, so I could record any sounds that I found interesting on the trail, and remember them, of course, later. And yes, these pictures on the side are the top one. Welcome to Connecticut, right? Just before I was about to hike and start the hike, and there I am on the top of Mount Katahdin at the end. So I made it. I made the hike. I completed it, at least my portion of the hike. And I was worried about that, but I did make it. And after the hike, then I took all these ideas that I gathered on the hike about the shape of the symphony and musical ideas and melodies and all these sort of things. And then it was time to do the traditional sort of composing work, right? Writing out the score and figuring out all those sort of things and all the notes. I mean, I think of what I did on the trail also as composing and part of the composing process, but I did the sort of nitty-gritty stuff after that in the fall of 2016 until March 2017. And then once I completed that, it was the final phase, right? The performances. So November 2017, first performance was with the Wesleyan College Orchestra in Middletown, Connecticut. They only did the first 3 movements, didn't do the last 2. And then the premiere of the entire symphony, April of the following year, with the Claflin Hill Symphony Orchestra in Milford, Massachusetts. And their recording is the one we will hear some excerpts of in a minute. And then a month later in Vermont, Bennington, Vermont, with the Sage City Symphony, which is this photo is from. I actually got to conduct that performance myself, which was really, really special. And then the following year, the Wellesley Symphony Orchestra, a community orchestra in Wellesley, Massachusetts as well. So the symphony was basically, I had this idea pretty early on in hiking that I wanted to try to make this half-hour-long symphony a condensed version of my 67-day hike. In other words, I wanted to have the length of each movement be roughly proportional to the length of trail in each state. For instance, Connecticut, the first state I was hiking through, has about 51 miles of trail. So in terms of half hour, that turns out to about 2 minutes of time. And then Massachusetts is a bit longer, almost twice as long, 90 miles of trail. So it's about twice, a little less than twice the length of Connecticut, about 3 minutes and 45 seconds. Vermont is even longer, 150 miles of trail. So it's about 5 minutes. New Hampshire, a little bit longer than Vermont, 161 miles, so about a minute longer in terms of the length of the music, 6 minutes. And then Maine at a whopping 282 miles, by far the longest part of the journey, is the largest chunk of the symphony as well. This was a really difficult parameter to sort of, and restriction to fit myself into, and it couldn't be exact for a lot of different reasons, but I tried to make it roughly proportional, and I think it works. So essentially, when you hear the symphony, you're going on my journey, but just in a very condensed way, and a condensed musical journey. So let's talk about each movement. So we start with Connecticut, as I said, and I decided that first thing you hear in the symphony would be an imitation of the sound of my footsteps entering the forest. And so I do that with the percussion instrument sand blocks, which is 2 blocks with sandpaper on them, and gets this kind of, almost like rustling of leaves sound. Then the next thing you hear is what I call the Keane theme on a clarinet. Now, why is it called the Keane theme? When I was out on the trail, as a way of just generating ideas and trying to come up with ideas I liked, I did what was called a musical cryptogram. And this is something that lots of composers in the past have done. which is to map the letters of the alphabet into musical pitches so that you can essentially encode words into a series of notes. For instance, a very famous example of this is Johann Sebastian Bach. His last name, he turned into a four-note motive, one, a B, A, C, H, because in German, H is B natural. So it worked out. And he wrote a couple pieces based and using on that as a musical theme, encoding himself into it. And so I did the same thing with my name. Actually, I tried this with a whole bunch of different words of different states, words of things I found out on the trail, of animals, of mountains, and things like that. Most of them came up with things that were not very interesting. But the Keane theme, which was F sharp, E, A, B, E, I actually really liked. And then there's another one, which we'll talk about in a couple more movements that I used. And then there's a third one I used as well that is kind of a hidden one that I'm not going to tell you about. And I picked the clarinet to present the Keane theme because, well, I'm a pianist. That's my primary instrument, but the orchestra I was writing for, I couldn't use a piano. So instead I used a clarinet because clarinet is the instrument I played in the school bands growing up. That best represents me entering the forest. And then after the Keane theme, after I leave civilization behind, I was starting to notice these sounds of the forest around me, birds and the wind and all these different things. So that's what I put into the music. After the Keane theme, you'll hear the very end of the Keane theme here, and then you'll start hearing things that sound like birds or imitations of all these different forest sounds. Yeah, so many of those were actually bird songs that I recorded and then transcribed and tried to put them into different instruments in the music as unchanged as I could. And Connecticut, as I said, is the shortest of the movements, the shortest state in the hike. After all these sounds come in, we get a crescendo, a build up to the peak of the movement because near the very end of the trail in Connecticut, you get to Bear Mountain, which is the highest summit in Connecticut. So that became the climactic moment of this movement at about 2,600 or 2,316 feet, which, as you'll see, is pretty short compared to some of the mountains we get to in the next ones. And then it was down into Massachusetts. Now, Massachusetts was where the mosquitoes and the flies really started to get annoying and make their presence felt. So I thought about how can I put that into music? And I decided to use the violins using a couple different interesting playing techniques. Playing tremolo, which just means they're moving their bow very quickly back and forth and doing very quick notes that kind of simulates a buzzing sort of sound. And then they play what's called sul ponticello, which is Italian for on the bridge. When you play, it's not where you usually put the bow, but playing there, you get this sort of glassy, sort of eerie sound. And then I also make the violins glissando, which is essentially sliding the pitch, up or down, rather than playing discrete pitches. And so mixing that all together and then having the violins do that on their own independently from each other to create this kind of swarm, I think worked pretty well. Here's what it sounds like. Oops, sorry. Yeah. And actually at the end there on the clarinet, you heard the Keane theme returned because I weave it throughout the entire symphony because of course I'm the one going on this journey. Pretty soon after that, in this movement, we hear a theme that is directly transcribed from a bird song I heard and that I recorded. And this bird song is very, very fast and very, very complex and complicated. So much so that I could not transcribe it at all when I was out on the trail. I had to wait till I was back home in the fall and composing, and I had to slow it down to a quarter speed just to be able to hear it. So 25% of the original speed. So I'm going to play you actually that original recording of the one I made of this bird. I don't know what kind of bird it is. I couldn't see it, and I'm not a bird expert on bird songs. But you'll hear it first as it naturally is, and then at a quarter speed. At a quarter speed. Yeah, it's amazing how intricate that is. And now here it is. I tried to keep it, I tried to use, I used most of it, and I tried to keep it pretty much as similar as possible, at least to the slowed down version, not the fast version. Yeah. And then eventually we get to the highest point on the hike in Massachusetts, Mount Greylock, highest point in Massachusetts, actually, as well, at 3,491 feet. And here I used a theme that was kind of derived from the Keane theme. I think I just heard it. It's not like it popped into my head when I was getting close to Greylock. And I thought, wow, that works really, really well as a kind of triumphant getting to the summit, sort of theme. So here it is. And then coming down from Greylock, it's pretty much straight into Vermont. At the beginning of the Vermont movement, we hear another cryptogram, this time the Vermont theme. Now, the Vermont theme it's kind of a little spooky and mysterious, which I felt kind of fit with the feelings at night, camping at night in Vermont. And so you hear this theme first, it goes da 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 in the glockenspiel and vibraphone, which are percussion instruments that have bell-like sounds. And here's what that sounds like. Now, I created that theme on the trail, but it wasn't until I was back home after the hike and composing and working on this that I thought, why does that kind of sound familiar? And I finally realized, oh, it is almost the exact same as the melody, the opening melody of the gospel hymn, Just a Closer Walk with Thee, which goes, just a closer walk with thee. In fact, there's only one interval that's different. There's one, the Vermont theme has a leap that goes lower, whereas in the hymn it goes, it leaps down, but not quite as far. And I thought that's an interesting similarity, and that's an interesting connection there, because just a closer walk with thee, obviously walking, I was walking and hiking. And it also ties in that this was a kind of spiritual journey as well for me, right? It was not just something I was trying to accomplish, right? It was also being out in nature. I felt closer to creation and to God. And I thought, that's too perfect, this similarity. So I'm going to weave that in there too, to tie in that sort of spiritual side as a spiritual journey as well. And then another really interesting thing, the trail in New Hampshire, or sorry, in Vermont here, goes through the very small mountain town of Shrewsbury, or through the woods of it. It doesn't go right through the downtown or anything. Shrewsbury, Vermont, I mean, it's a population about maybe 1,000 people, is actually where my grandfather, my mother's father, was born back in 1921, I think. My grandfather is sort of where I get my musical genes. He loved music, played a lot of instruments growing up. He went to college. He wanted to be a conductor. He studied music for a couple of years. He never finished his studies. World War II broke out, and he never got back to it. But so I kind of feel like me being I've sort of fulfilled some of those dreams of my grandfather. And I was thinking about him a lot as I was hiking through Shrewsbury. And so I decided to use, I actually have these old music theory notebooks of his from college, where he did these different exercises and wrote these little chorales, these little chord progressions. And I decided to use one of those that I thought was kind of interesting, and some interesting twists in it, and use that in the symphony to make that connection to my grandfather. So that's, this is what that little chorale from my grandfather sounds like. Yeah, so you heard that it was with the brass instruments, the trumpets and the trombones there. And then again, like the previous movements, I wanted to really highlight the highest point, have the highest point on the trail in that state correspond with the climax of each movement. So we get to Killington Peak, which is the highest point on the Appalachian Trail in Vermont. It's the second highest point in Vermont, second highest peak in Vermont. At 4,236 feet, so higher than the previous peaks we've had. And here I actually combined all three themes, the Vermont theme, the Just a Closer Walk with Thee, and my grandpa's hymn or chorale. And it kind of worked. I had to change some things a little bit. But you get the Vermont theme in the glockenspiel and vibraphone, the bell sounds. You get Just a Closer Walk with Thee in the violins, and then you get the brass doing the chorale. And here's what it sounds like. And then leaving Vermont after that, we actually get to, before we get into New Hampshire, we get our first break between movements. Usually in multi-movement works like classical symphonies, you get a break between each movement. The movement ends, you turn the page, you have a little, someone might cough in the audience, and then you start the next movement, right? But I decided to have no break between those three movements, between Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Vermont, because I didn't have a break. I just hiked straight through. But when I finished Vermont and arrived in Hanover, New Hampshire, in that area is where I was living at the time anyways. That's when I had my break, and I went to Brazil for 10 days. So I decided will be the only break in the symphony. Then we'll hear New Hampshire and Maine will flow one right into another as well. So then, yeah, when we start in New Hampshire is dominated by the White Mountains. Now, the White Mountains are the highest peaks in all of the northeast part of the United States. Highest peaks on my trail, some over 5,000 feet, Mount Washington over 6,000 feet, just going higher and higher. But as you go up these, you have you always come back down to these notches. There's Pinkham Notch and Kinsman Notch and Crawford Notch, these sort of deep valleys. So it's a lot of up and down and the steepest parts of the hike for me. So I decided to make the music sound much more, have sharper contrast, quicker contrasts, big climaxes, but then very soft moments as well that come back down. It's more dissonant, more angular and jagged in terms of the harmonies and chords I'm using. And then two little points I want to point out in this movement that I want to highlight. Franconia Ridge, which is this mile or mile and a half long, very exposed rocky ridge in between Mount Lincoln over to Mount Lafayette at 5,000 feet. And I had beautiful weather that day, and it was just some of the most stunning scenery and most exciting hiking I had. And so I used some of the themes I used before, the Keane theme and the summit theme, and changed them in some ways to make this sense of just these grand sort of majestic vistas for that moment. And then Mount Washington is the highest point, was the highest point on my hike. It's the highest point in New Hampshire. It's the highest point in the entire northeast part of the United States. So I thought, this is got to be the loudest part of the symphony, the biggest climax, right? And when you get close to your final ascent up to the summit of Mount Washington, there's this absolutely terrifying sign you run into that says, warning, the area up ahead has the worst weather in North America. Turn back if the weather is bad. People have died even in the summer because of its exposure and bad weather. So there's this sense of like, wow, there's some real danger here, this can be a really scary place. And in fact, and then you combine that also with, at the top of Mount Washington, there's all these tourists who didn't hike up there, but there's a road you can drive up to the top, and there's also a cog railway you can take up. So there's all these people, and it's, there's noise, and it's like, you don't feel like you were on some of these other summits where you could only hike up to there, and it's just a couple of people maybe up there, or maybe you're all by yourself. So there's this danger, there's this more noise and of, some civilization and hecticness. But at the same time, being close to the summit, I had some really beautiful moments of just stillness and calm looking over all of New England. And so I wanted to show that with some really sharp contrast, some of the loudest music I've written in the whole symphony, with some of contrasted all of a sudden with some of the softest and the most sort of pristine music. And then finally we get to Maine, the longest movement with the most amount of trail. Now, after getting past the White Mountains, which were so up and down, and it felt like you were going so slow in terms of mileage, you thought, wow, okay, I'm getting into Maine. The mountains aren't quite as high. I can move faster. But no, it felt like, and I remember talking to some other hikers about this. They had the same sort of feeling that you felt like you just did 18 miles and you really did 12. And you were like, why it feels so slow going? It feels like, oh, like you really have to, like, you're dragging your feet, you can't go as fast as you want. And so I wanted to reflect that in the beginning of Maine, having this sort of slower tempo music that feels labored, with each sort of footstep. But eventually, after, I don't know, maybe 100 miles or so, the terrain becomes much flatter. And I was finally able to hike much quicker. In fact, I remember I had by far, the most mileage I covered in one day, over 26 miles. And my previous longest day was 18 miles. So in the music, then, there's this moment where it just sort of takes off and goes flying, and the tempo picks up, and it just starts moving a lot more. And then, almost the very end of the trail, is the 100-mile wilderness. 100-mile wilderness is 100 miles of no towns, no services, no public roads. It actually wasn't that hard to hike. You just have to carry a lot of supplies up front. But the really nice thing about it was that you started to get these vistas of Mount Katahdin, which is the ending point, off in the distance. And you'd see it, and then, a day later, you'd see it again, and it's bigger. And it gets bigger every time you see it. And so there was this growing sense of, wow, I'm really going to make it. I can see the end. It's getting closer. And this feeling of accomplishment, of pride, of, wow, it's really coming to end this journey. So I have my footsteps return, the sand blocks come back. And I had this theme that came to me at some point that I thought, man, this works perfectly for, that sense of growing pride and accomplishment as we approach Katahdin. There's the sand blocks. And then, of course, finally, we get to the summit of Mount Katahdin and finishing the hike. Finish my hike at the highest point in Maine, at over 5,000 feet. And here we get the summit theme, the Keane theme, and it's really celebratory. There's even, I've got these cymbal crashes at the end that are kind of like, I don't know, I imagine like fireworks. There wasn't literally fireworks, of course, but you know, that sense of completion and pride. And I want to mention one little last thing there. After the sort of fireworks and the cymbals and everything, it got calmer and kind of almost ominous a little bit there for a moment for the last buildup at the very end. That actually reflects two things. One, my day on Katahdin was completely in the clouds and overcast. I couldn't see any of the vistas, really. I could see a little bit. It was finally starting to break a little bit when I was going down. But it was still kind of ominous up there. And there was this like crow or raven at the top too that felt kind of like a strange ominous omen. So there's a little bit of darkness in there at the end too. So some final thoughts on this is that, you know, this whole piece was about, I really wanted to bring the listeners along for the hike, you know, in this condensed sort of form, not a piece that lasted as long as my hike did, not a 2-month piece, but giving them some sort of sense of what it was like to be out on the trail and to encourage people to get out there themselves, either on the Appalachian Trail or in their local trails or wilderness. And of course, if possible, right? Some people can't because of, you know, physical limitations or disabilities. So this was a way of also bringing the trail experience to them in a way, you know. I want to say this also it's not just a reflection of the trail itself and the beauty of the trail, but also more specifically, my unique experience of the trail. For instance, another composer who writes, you know, did a hike like this and wrote a piece on it might have a completely different musical result, right? So it's really an expression of how it was as a physical journey and also a spiritual journey, what it was like for me on the inside and the outside. And then it's been performed those 4 times by the 4 orchestras that helped co-commission it. But I would love to have it performed more. And also to make a commercial studio recording at some point in the future too would be fantastic. Because, I mean, you wouldn't notice, but there are all these little mistakes everywhere in, you know, even in, you know, in each performance. And I would love to have a really polished one, but that costs a lot of money. So, you know, if you have connections with your local orchestra and you want to hear it performed, you know, maybe you can introduce them to it. Or if you know someone who might have the means to help fund a studio recording, I would love to connect with them too. So thank you very much. Here's my email if you have questions after this, my website, and I'll share, this link is to the recording of the entire symphony, and it's also set to a slideshow of my pictures I took on the hike. So when you hear the music for Mount Washington, you get to see my photos from Mount Washington. You know, I synced it up like that. So
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating, Keane. And I mean, you touched on it at the end, but the story, not only your story, but the geological story you tell. And I didn't until you mentioned it. I'm like, wow, every state ended with the high point, with this crescendo, with this mountain. Did you
Yeah.
write anything? Was there anything, or did you explain it when you were performing those 4 times?
Yeah, when you have usually when in concert programs, you can put program notes, which can give background about the piece. And yeah, uh, I have a lot, very long program notes, so probably people didn't read all of them. But yeah, that goes into some of this detail, although this is much more detailed than in theirs, but sort of gives that, explanation of some of those things. And it's
Yeah,
interesting, you said like, I decided to, highlight some of the mountains. At some point on the trail, I was thinking, oh, maybe I could use the actual elevation profile of, to like make and that was just too much. It would have been too much detail, so I had to be like, well, let me just take some of the biggest mountains and the biggest sort of highlights, and put it in. And that was much more feasible. Yeah.
well, it really comes alive hearing like the little elements of the mosquitoes were really annoying, and this was my personal theme. And I love that. I hope you can do this in a more, recorded professional setting and be able to explain those tidbits. I think it really makes it breathe and live.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, so I want to open it up to any of you out there. I know I saw a question about photos, but then you mentioned you do have a recording with Set It to Your Photos. Again, that
Yes,
sounds like a great
exactly. Yeah.
idea.
And I will say
Uh,
that I didn't get to bring my nice digital SLR camera because it was just too heavy. I had to use a little point and shoot, but the pictures are pretty good. They're not as nice a quality as I would have hoped, but uh, yeah, I did get I do have a little hobby with photography, um, so I think I have some nice pictures in there, some interesting pictures.
so if there's anyone out there with a question, you're welcome to come off mute and ask Keen or make a comment.
I was just wondering whether, a la like Beethoven with Pastoral, etc., do you have a sort of descriptive sub-theme title for your symphony, or is it Keane's Southard's blankety blank?
It's an Appalachian Trail Symphony, New England.
Ah,
And
okay,
then Symphony number 1, because it's my first symphony. So yeah.
okay, yeah, and did you ever consider using the snarky commentary from the Raven as a little comic touch at the end?
No, but I in terms of snarky things, one thing that's really interesting, if you've done hikes on any of these long distance trails, is there are these journals. When you get to shelters and things, there are these notebooks where
Oh,
you're supposed to sign your name and the date you were there. And this has a couple functions. I mean, some of it is like for trail usage data. They collect, how many people are using the trail. And if you get lost, they can sort of try to pinpoint where you might be based on when you last signed into one of these. But it's literally just a notebook and a pen, and people can write whatever they want. And there's some very interesting things you learn about other hikers or hikers you met that have been there, like, oh, that you lost touch with, but then you see that they were here days before, and I thought, oh, I should do like write some songs setting some of these interesting entries in these, might be fun. Because some are, funny and people draw things, and sometimes people get into really personal things of why they're hiking and things like that. Um,
yeah.
that's, that might be another project that comes out of this whole experience. Yeah.
Did you carry an instrument at all, or like a flute or anything like that when you were on the trail?
Nope. Everything was, I mean, of course, I always carry an instrument, which is my voice. You know, we always carry that instrument. But no, I did most, it was in my head, everything. And, you know, I really wanted to try to do more listening than creating sound, you know, really be receiving sounds and trying to be, mindful about that and what's around me and being open to it rather than trying to add my sound into that space too much.
So just out of curiosity, my experience with the Appalachian Trail was in Scouts in Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. And of course, we were near a lot of Civil War battlefields and other historic sites, and the place where Washington's army bedded down for a while and all that stuff is the New England part, like, also, does it have that kind of stuff going on? Bootleggers, yeah, a little bit of everything. Yeah,
I don't
human
think there's a
history.
ton in terms of like Civil War things. I do know that because I also lived in Bennington, Vermont, which the trail goes just through the town just to the east of it. And there's the Battle of Bennington, although it's actually, I think, technically just over the border in New York, so the opposite direction. But no, I don't think I know of any
Yeah.
connections like that up there. You know, you talked about hiking, down in the mid-Atlantic states, you know, on the trail. I do have this greater idea of, what if I do, you know, the other 2/3 of the trail at some point and write 2 more symphonies and have this trilogy, Appalachian Trail trilogy of symphonies. I
Yeah,
don't know if I'll ever have the opportunity to do that. It depends on a lot of things. But I've had that as an idea of like, because it would be a very different experience, you know, going through that part of the country, you know, those different parts of the country. And maybe that's something like that, the connections to those Civil War battle sites and things like that would somehow make it in, you know.
French and Indian, you know, whatever. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
We have another question out there.
Hi, Keane. This is
Hi,
Megan.
Megan.
Hi,
Megan.
and it's so funny to call you Keane because I know you as Mozart.
Yeah,
which
we
which
met
is
on
your-
the long trail in
That's right.
2021.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good memory. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and you were with your friend Guitar Zan. So I don't know if you
David,
talked. I had to join a little bit late in your talk tonight, and I don't know if you talked about trail names at all, but I'm curious how you earned your trail name. It may be kind of obvious, but
well, I gave
you have
it
a
to
story?
myself as a way to help people make the connection that, you know, with the project, you know, that I was
Nice.
doing that
Yeah.
as a composer, you know. So I picked, you know, one of the most
Yeah.
well-known composers. And then you realize, oh yes, that's a composer, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's perfect. And
Yeah.
I remember you when I met you, I remember you telling me how you translated some of the bird sounds that you heard into parts of your symphony. And I was so excited to go back home and listen to it, which I did. And I think I saw the video that has the images. And but I really love the snippets that you pulled out tonight. And it also reminded me that there are other people doing a little bit of what you do in different genres. So I have a friend who was translating bird songs into weaving. So she actually found a way to digitize these bird songs and then turn it, like, somehow figure out how to like make it work with her loom, and she wove bird songs onto a loom. And then I was taking hand drumming lessons from a guy, and he said he hears rhythms in the world all the time. And he was talking specifically about listening to a bird at one point and kind of translated that into his drumming rhythms. So it's just neat to see this kind of collection of folks like you who are listening to nature and turning it into your art. And yeah, you did a great job, and it's really inspiring.
Thanks. Yeah.
Oh, and I climbed Katahdin last summer.
Okay.
So
Great.
yeah, I skipped the rest.
I want to go back and do Katahdin on a clear day.
It's worth it.
See the view,
Yeah.
So
You know,
you,
the idea of putting, yeah, in other art forms, translating experiences or different things into, or landscapes. I think there's so many different ways to do it. You know, like each of us find our own way to do it. It's not like, you know, there's a formula like, oh, this is how you know, translate a hike into music. You know, no, that's just the way I found to do it. Here we also have, I know Stephen Lias, who I don't know how he's done all these things of with national parks, right? Going to national parks and turning those into pieces of music. And I'm sure his processes and ways are very different, or maybe some ways similar to the ways I've done it. You know? Oh, and I want to say also, Megan, that yeah, that summer when I went back and finished the long trail. So in southern Vermont, where I am now, the Appalachian Trail and the long trail, which runs the whole spine of Vermont, 272 miles, I think, a lot shorter than the Appalachian Trail, but they're concurrent for about 100 miles. And so I'd already done 100 miles, and then I went back in 2021 with a friend of mine, and we finished the rest of the long trail. And I do have an idea. I want to write a long trail piece. I'm trying to get an orchestra here in Vermont on board with that idea to write a shorter piece reflecting the long trail.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. Well, so nice to see you again.
Yeah, nice. Thanks for coming.
Yeah. I actually have to buzz off, but I wanted to say hi.
Okay, bye.
We have time for one more question, then we'll get into the giveaway portion of tonight. Is anyone
have
else
a-
there?
I have a composer kind of question.
Sure. Hi, Judith. I remember you from in Toronto. Yeah.
Yeah, I wondered if you would,
Yeah.
would. And, but
The
to what?
Unitaki strings. Yeah, I remember. Mhm.
Oh, and you were doing something with fourths, as I recall, that particular piece.
Parallel fourths and stuff.
Yeah. Anyway, to what extent did the structure that you had pre-set out help, and to what extent did it get in the way? Was there something musically you wanted to do that, oh darn, the height comes here? You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, it was really tricky. I felt really strongly about that idea, though, of the proportionality. I thought that would be so interesting. That I did have to do quite a bit of bending ideas or yeah, it was tricky. I don't remember exactly some of the decisions I made, but I remember it was a tough restriction to set for myself. But I think I made it work.
Well, I look forward to hearing the piece after this. I copied the link.
Thank you.
Anyway.
yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Keane. This was a really fascinating glimpse into, yes, how do you turn this into, and like you said, there's probably a million different ways you could have gone about it. And just so interesting. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your story with us.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So with that, I want to mention, so tonight we're raising money for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. They're the nonprofit partner that Keane chose to donate proceeds that y'all gave during registration. So the ATC was established in 1925, and they lead the effort to protect, maintain, and celebrate the Appalachian Trail. So you all raised $52 for the AT during registration, and also $52 for Keane. So thank you for your generosity tonight. And then there also the giveaway for tonight. So I'm going to share my screen. So you'll have an opportunity to win a year's membership to the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. So a membership to the ATC protects the trail all the way from Georgia to Maine, so that future generations across the world can continue to find inspiration out there. It helps advance the largest conservation initiative in the eastern United States by protecting the corridor along the trail. It safeguards one of the most biodiverse units of the National Park Service, which is home to hundreds of threatened and endangered species. And a membership also helps educate millions of visitors on how to have safe and successful journeys on the AT. So if you win the membership tonight, that will include an oversized Appalachian Trail map that you can put on your wall, a subscription to their magazine, AT Journeys. You'll get discounts to the Appalachian Trail store and some other retailers. And then you'll have the opportunity to sign up for some volunteer trips and invitations to special events. So for the giveaway, this is going to be a piece of AT trivia. So get your chat box open. This will be the first person to answer correctly in the chat will win. So I'll give you all a minute to get ready with the chat. Who was the first person to propose the Appalachian Trail idea, and in what year? So you need the name of the person who proposed the AT and what year it was proposed. So go ahead and if you know the answer, type it in and you will win the membership. Mary Fire, got Benton Mackay, or I think it's pronounced Mackay. Yes, Benton Mackay. Does anyone happen to have a guess about the year that it was proposed? Well, since I don't see the answer, I'll go ahead and tell you it was 1921 that he proposed the AT. And fun fact, he was actually on a high point, or one of the high points in Vermont, Stratton Mountain, when he came up with the idea. And there's actually a plaque up there about him having the idea while he was hiking, and it's now a beautiful section of the trail. So Mary, you were closest to getting the full answer, so congrats, we'll get you a membership to the Appalachian Trail Conservancy.